The phone rings in the home of Jessica Reyes. A port agent for a Chinese fishing company tells her she's needed at one of the local hospitals to translate for an Indonesian deckhand. The port agent describes the problem as a stomachache.
Por eso ese día yo estaba en la casa donde yo vivía y me llamaron. ¿Estás ocupada? A las 2 de la mañana llega un barco.
This wasn't the first time Reyes had been hired to interpret for a crew member in distress. As Montevideo has become a regular stop for Chinese fishing boats, she has received hundreds of similar calls. Most of the deckhands on Chinese fishing boats are Indonesians, and she is the only Bahasa-capable interpreter in the city.
La china me llama, me dice, mira, te va a pasar un remix a las 2 de la mañana.
At the hospital, Reyes found a young man named Daniel Aritonang. He was in his early 20s, lying on a gurney in the ambulance bay. He whispered to her that he'd been beaten and tied by the neck, that he hadn't eaten in weeks.
Lo que pasa es que el muchacho cuando llegó estaba vivo, pero estaba todo golpeado y lo único que me decía que tenía miedo.
Daniel's limbs and face were grotesquely swollen. His eyes were black, and he had bruises on his neck and torso. As Reyes was sent out of the hospital room to wait in the hall, Daniel, crying and shaking, asked her, "Please, where are my friends? I'm scared." The youngest of 3 brothers, Daniel grew up on the Indonesian island of Sumatra. As a teenager, he spent his free time working on motorcycles in the shop his father ran next to the family home, rebuilding engines and patching tires, slipping away sometimes with friends to drag race his small blue Yamaha King of the Street motorcycle.
Jelas anaknya tuh kocak, terus banyakan ibarat itu senda gurau dia anaknya tuh. Terus apa-apa serba ingin tahu dia tuh.
His teachers described him as punctual, earnest, a tidy dresser, and a class clown who liked to flirtatiously prank the girls in his class.
Orangnya kalau Daniel tuh ini gimana? Senang-senang, ceria.
Ceria.
Iya.
Oke.
Sini, situ. Ke gereja pun rajin.
Ya. Kekanak-kanakan kayak gitu nah.
Jahil kah gitu?
Iya, jahil. Habis itu apa ya? Banyak ulah lah kayak
Banyak
gitu.
ulah.
Enggak apa segala macam diingetin sama dia.
Itu.
Perhatian.
Oh ya ampun.
Memang mungkin di dalam keluarganya tuh mungkin dia yang paling rumah anak perhati sama ibunya gitu saling ini.
Lalu anaknya baik. Nah, ya. Agak beda dengan abangnya. Kalau abangnya karakternya agak apa namanya tuh laki-laki yang agak keras ya. Tapi Daniel ini kalem orangnya dan tidak banyak ngomong.
In May 2018, Daniel graduated from high school. He applied for jobs at the local mini market and plastic and textile factories, but no one was hiring. Youth unemployment in the village was over 13%.
Kemudian cari kerja dengan saya, cari kerja ke berbagai perusahaan di Bengkulu. Ternyata hasilnya nihil, nggak dapat.
Kalau di darat kan mau skill.
Yo.
Saya ini nggak punya skill. Mau ngapa-ngapain nggak bisa.
Ya.
Terus mau gimana kalau nggak ke laut?
Many other villagers were returning home from work on foreign fishing ships with enough money to buy motorcycles, land, and their own houses. With no apparent options for finding work in the village, Daniel liked the idea of heading out to sea, as long as he could stay together with his friends.
Berarti kamu timbullah inisiatif, kamu mau ke laut gitu kan? Niat kamu mau ke laut ya sekarang? Ya, saya mau ke laut. Tapi barengan kita, jangan sampai pisah. Ya udah, tanggal sekian kita berangkat ke Jawa, kita selesai.
In the first week of July of that year, Daniel set out with his friend Henki for Tegal, a city in central Java, to apply for work through a manning agency that recruits and supplies workers to foreign fishing ships.
Nggak mau berangkat kalau mau pisah, nggak mau berangkat.
The two young men took medical exams and handed over their passports, copies of their birth certificates and bank documents, along with several headshots. For the next 2 months, Daniel waited in Tegal to hear if he and Henki would get a ship assignment. Money ran short.
Dia ngechat saya kan di Messenger, minta tolong transfer duit.
Untuk Daniel?
Untuk Daniel, karena dia udah nggak ada lagi duit dan udah habis-habisan katanya.
On September 1st, the manning agency told Daniel and Henki to fly to Busan, South Korea, where they assumed they would be working on a South Korean vessel. But when they got to the port, they were told to climb aboard a Chinese vessel, a red and white squid jigger called the Zhen Fa 7.
Lihat bendera Cina, kapal Cina ini kataku. Kapal cumi, lihatin di PKL kapal cumi gimana? Gini. Tanda tangan.
The manning agency had the young men sign a 2-year contract.
Kapal operasi sekian bulan, sandar ntar 8 bulan satu kali sandar. Kantor tuh ngomong, tapi nyatanya nggak ada nyandar. Nggak ada 2 tahun di tengah terus kami.
It took roughly 3 months for the Zhen Fa 7 to travel the 8,000 miles to the high seas fishing grounds west of the Galapagos Islands. On board were 20 Chinese crew and 8 other Indonesians. Daniel couldn't have known it at the time, but by becoming a crew member on a Chinese squid fishing vessel, he had just stepped onto the lowest rung of what may be the largest maritime operation the world has ever known. And on the Zhen Fa 7, Daniel and his friends had entered a world of neglect and violence, one in which they would be captives with little to no hope for escape.
Intinya sangat tidak dikasih apa-apa, dikekang, dikandang seperti di penjara, posisi di kapal itu.
The officers on the ship, all of whom were Chinese, were especially rough with the Indonesian deckhands. The bosun, or deck boss, slapped or punched the Indonesians for mistakes, slights, or slowness.
Kerja sama orang Cina itu sangat-sangat buruk lah. Tidak bisa diulangi lagi intinya. Kasar sekali kalau kita.
Kalau main tangan sering mandornya nih anak kok. Dan orang Indonesia kan nggak punya harga diri lah kita kayak gitu kan dipegang kepala.
Kita selama 1 tahun itu dikasih air minum yang kotor, sedangkan orang Cinanya sendiri dapat jatahan air bersih yang layak diminum, sedangkan orang Indonesia itu selama 1 tahun di situ itu minumnya air kotor terus.
For rations, the Zhen Fa 7's deckhands were given 2 boxes of instant noodles per week. Additional snacks, coffee, and cigarettes were deducted from their paychecks.
Ya, supermi itu kan jatah Bu. Kalau kebutuhan lain seperti rokok ataupun kopi, snack segala macam itu kan masuk bon.
Oh, kita beli sebenarnya.
Ya, beda kalau dengan jatah.
Chinese crew members were occasionally allowed to use the satellite phone on the ship's bridge to make calls. But when Daniel and the other Indonesians asked to call home, the captain refused. Daniel's family would go over a year before hearing anything from him.
Yang saya rasakan paling sulit itu menghubungi keluarga. Posisi itu rasanya sangat sulit sekali untuk menghubungi keluarga, karena saya tidak dikasih wifi, tidak dikasih telepon sama kapten.
Gak bakalan lebih enak dari orang Cina. Orang Cina situ naik ke atas nelpon. Tahu kami tuh, lihat nelpon itu.
On New Year's Day 2021, 16 months after setting sail from Busan, the Zhen Fa 7 headed from Chile eastward around the southern tip of South America, towards rich fishing grounds near the Falkland Islands, in an area known as the Blue Hole. While passing through the Strait of Magellan, the ship stopped briefly in Chilean waters near Punta Arenas, several hundred yards from shore, close enough to make a cell phone call.
HP orang Cina, nah dapat sinyal pas di Chili kemarin, di pelabuhan Chili itu kan dekat dengan daratan, cuma berapa ratus meter dari daratan, jadi dapat sinyal. Terus bilang, bisa nggak telepon ke Indonesia? Bisa katanya. Terus gimana katanya, kalau mau bayar, ini telepon katanya, kita hitung per menit.
Daniel ran below deck, gathering up cigarettes and snacks, and then quickly making the rounds, begging other deckhands to buy them.
Terserah katanya. Ini tolong bayar dulu, aku mau nelpon katanya. Kasihlah 100 yuan, dapatlah 5 menit. Ini bapak dengan ibu saksi, nggak lama saya nelpon.
Daniel and Henki agreed to split the 5 minutes to call their families. Daniel dialed his parents' house, where his mother answered.
Dan dia nanya, mana bapakku, aku mau ngomong. Kata mamanya masih tidur. Dia berkata, nanti kalau anakku ini shock. Nanti aku mau pulang, nanti lebaran, Ma.
The truth was that Daniel's father, Joni, had died from a heart attack just days earlier. But Daniel's mother thought the news would upset him too much, with him being so far from home. He would never learn the truth of his father's passing, because just a few weeks after making the call home, Daniel fell severely ill.
Daniel sakit perut.
Gitu dia bilangnya.
Iya.
Okay.
Sakit perut, dikasih obat. Kasih obat dari atas.
Yang sakit di kapal itu Heri Kusmanto dengan Daniel sampai bengkak-bengkak dan menjadi matanya kuning itu.
Pertama, Daniel sakit. Sebelum saya jaga kan belum terlalu drop. Masih punya tenaga, istilahnya masih gagah.
For weeks, as Daniel's condition slowly deteriorated, the other Indonesians on board pleaded with the captain to allow Daniel to get onshore medical attention. But the captain refused to leave the fishing grounds.
Setelah 1 bulan berjalan, kondisi semakin drop. Nah disitulah gimana caranya nih.
Dan pas di Argentina sudah parah, kita berontak sama kapten untuk memulangkan Daniel.
Orang Indonesia, semua orang Indonesia ngomong sama itu. Kalau sampai enggak, kami nggak mau kerja lagi, mau pulang semua.
The captain finally acquiesced on March 2nd, transferring Daniel to a nearby fuel tanker called the Marlin, which agreed to carry him to Montevideo.
Hati-hati, saya bilang, saya pegang pundaknya. Hati-hati Nel, kamu di sana mudah-mudahan nggak lama sehat, katanya, bisa pulang. Ya udah katanya. Pasangin lip jacket segala macam lah itu. Jadi kirimlah Daniel ini tadi ke kapal.
Daniel was transferred from the Zhen Fa 7 to the fuel tanker Marlin on March 2nd, and he arrived in Montevideo 6 days later, on March 8th. And rather than carrying Daniel all the way to shore, the Marlin crew put him in a skiff and dumped him on the port before motoring away. Just over 2 hours after arriving at the hospital, Daniel Aritonang died. Daniel most likely died from a form of acute malnutrition known as beriberi, caused by a lack of vitamin B1, also known as thiamine. Experts say that allowing workers on fishing ships to contract and die from beriberi constitutes criminal neglect, because the disease is so easily prevented through proper nutrition or vitamin pills and can be treated when it occurs. Daniel's body was flown from Montevideo to Jakarta on April 22nd, The next day, it was driven by ambulance to his family home in Bengkulu, where a crowd of villagers lined the road to pay their respects.
Ya, saya tanyakan, maksud saya gimana Kap yang ini Cap, masalah Daniel di darat, udah sehat, aku udah dibawa pulang. Ya kaptennya gitu-gitulah, Bo, kayak menghindar istilahnya. Terus ngomong-ngomong apa-apa masalah Indonesia gimana hidup di sana kan.
For over 3 months, the captain of the Zhen Fa 7 kept Daniel's death a secret from Hanky and the other Indonesian deckhands as they continued their fishing operations. It wasn't until after they had disembarked from the Zhen Fa 7 on July 2nd that they learned of Daniel's fate.
Baru tahu kami gitu dari teman kapal sebelah kami. Kami di kapal itu ada tahu, sekira kami sehat pulang. Nah disitulah kami tahu Daniel udah nggak ada lagi di Singapura.
By the time Hanky and the other Indonesian deckhands had made it home, Daniel's body had long been buried in the village cemetery, laid to rest just a few feet from his father, his grave marker bearing the last name of his mother.
Berangkat, ya niatkan mau berangkat dari sini kan, mau bantuin orang tua, Bu.
Ya.
Tujuan kami itu mau gitu. Terus sampai di sana, ntar kalau pulang uangnya kamu mau ngapain? Uang mau kamu taruh di mana atau mau kamu bikin apa kan? Sharing lah istilahnya, cerita. Saya bilang saya mau gini, kalau punya uang ntar mau gini ya. Ya udah kamu gimana Nel? Dibilang ada Nel, saya mau bikin ini usaha. Ya, atau kan mau bikin rumah kan segala macam lah.
Usahanya.
Tapi kalau kita nyeritakan pada saat ini belum sanggup kan, tapi ya buktinya kamu sendiri kan melihat posisi sekarang, ya gimana lah.
Daniel's family signed a non-disclosure agreement with the Chinese fishing company. In exchange for releasing the company from wrongdoing, they received the equivalent of about $13,000. Money they ended up using to repair their roof. Daniel managed to fix up his parents' house after all.
Sembilan lah namanya ditinggal anak kami ini
Nggak boleh diungkapkan. Iya, namanya udah